The Shroud of Turin has been hailed by some as the authentic burial cloth of Jesus Christ, while others have denounced it as a clever medieval fake. In an effort to determine the authenticity of the shroud, a group of scholars and researchers traveled to the Renaissance Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy, to examine and study the shroud utilizing advanced scientific research techniques. Several of these experts participated in a symposium held at Elizabethtown College, Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania, where they presented their varying viewpoints on the issue of the shroud as an object of archaeological significance. The symposium was jointly sponsored by the Cultural Events Committee of Elizabethtown College and the Marguerite Ayer Wilbur Foundation of Santa Barbara, California. It was organized by Dr. W. Wesley McDonald, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Elizabethtown College. This program is the second in the series of 7 presentations on the shroud, videotaped at the Mystery of the Shroud of Turin Symposium, and features Gilbert R. Lavoie, M.D., Chairman of West Roxbury Medical Associates in Boston, Massachusetts, whose authoritative articles on the shroud have appeared in Biblical Archaeologist and Shroud Spectrum.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning. I first became interested in the shroud simply by accident. A number of years ago, walking into a bookstore in Boston, I came across a book called A Doctor at Calvary by Dr. Pierre Barbet. I was in pre-med at the time, and I'm sure that that's the only reason I picked it up, because I saw the word doctor on it, and I brought it back to my room at the college, and I began reading it. That was my first introduction to a cloth that it could have possibly covered the body of Christ. And as I began reading it, I thought, how preposterous. I never had heard of such a thing. But by the time I finished reading the book, I was so fascinated by the work that Dr. Barbet had done that I promised myself, if I should ever have an opportunity in the future, that I would study this subject. The years went by, and I was in my home in Boston reading the Sunday Globe in the spring of 1978 when I read about the Shroud of Turin, that it was going to be shown in Turin, Italy, and there was going to be an exposition and then a scientific study on this cloth. So I went back and looked for the original book, which I never found, and tried to find somebody that I could contact in order to become aware and get some knowledge on this subject. And I came across the name of a Father Peter Rinaldi, who was living in Portchester, New York, and I wrote to him, but unfortunately at that point in time he had already left for Turin, Italy. I never received a word at that point in time, so my wife and I took our chances, and we flew into Turin, and we got at the hotel, and there, of course, we were very anxious to see this cloth that I had read something about. So I asked the hotel manager, I said, please help me. I said, how do I get to the cathedral? And he gave me directions, and I walked through the city of Turin, a very nice metropolitan city, and finally I arrived at this point, and I'd like the lights down. We start with the slides, please. We came to this line. And of course, we were very anxious to get to the end of this line, and we were very anxious to see what was around the corner. And as we turned the corner, this is what we saw. Well, we waited in that line about 3 hours, and finally, we arrived in the front of the cathedral, and as we entered the cathedral, this is what we saw. Under bulletproof glass, under large lights, at the head of the front of the cathedral was the Shroud of Turin. And after waiting about 3 hours in that line, we probably had about 3 minutes in front of the shroud, because we had the men there kept saying, "Avanti, avanti," and they moved us on so quickly that we could hardly have a moment to take a picture. This is the cathedral where the shroud has been kept for the past 400 years. And this is where in the cathedral where the shroud is actually kept. After we saw the shroud that day, we were very interested in finding out where the scientific group was and trying to find Father Rinaldi. And after looking about, we finally found Father Rinaldi in one of the local hotels. And he had received my letter, and he was most cordial and most helpful. And he promised me that he would help me to take some pictures of the shroud, some of which I will be showing you this morning. Now, I'm not going to mention too much about the history, in that it'll be mentioned at a later date by another speaker, but I'd like you to remember 3 dates. First date is 1357. From 1357 to the present time, the whereabouts and the existence of the shroud is well known. From 1357 back, it's up, the whereabouts of the shroud, if it did exist, is unknown. The other date I'd like to remember is 1532, because it was in Chambéry that a fire took place in the cathedral, in a small chapel where the shroud was kept, and nearly destroyed the shroud. Some burn marks, it, however, was saved, and I'll show you some of the burn marks that were on that occurred during that fire in 1532. Another date that I'd like you to remember is 1898, and that's when the first picture of the shroud was taken. Now, as a physician, I would like to present to you the medical aspects of the Shroud of Turin, and in order to do this, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about crucifixion. First of all, a little history on crucifixion. Crucifixion was a well-known death penalty during the Roman era. It was a horrible form of punishment. It was used generally for slaves and not the Roman citizens. And the soldiers that did the crucifying knew their business. The individual would be taken, the condemned individual would be taken, and he would be scourged or not scourged, depending on what they decided to do with him. And then he would be given his cross, but he wouldn't be given the entire cross, but he would be given the crossbar here. And he would carry that through the streets to the place of crucifixion. And once he reached the place of crucifixion, he would then be either tied or nailed to the crossbeam being lifted up on a beam that was already in the ground, and then his legs would be either tied or nailed to the post in the ground. Now, once an individual is hung up on a cross, a couple of things are going on with regard to his ability to exist up there. First of all, he is hanging from his arms, and the support is on the arms, full support, and he's just hanging there, and his chest is expanded out as if he's taking in a deep breath. This cuts down his ability to breathe in the sense that his rib cage is rather immobilized, and the only thing that's left is a very large diaphragm between the chest and the abdominal organs, which help him breathe. But the amount of air that he can breathe in and out is cut down. And at the same time, while he's simply just hanging there, the blood is just falling down toward his legs, and he is beginning to slowly die in shock. In order to survive, keep a man alive, it is very important that the legs are supported. Without the support of the legs, a man dies rather rapidly, and we know this. If we look back in the Bible, we see that in order for a man to bring his death on rapidly, they would break the individual's legs, and by breaking the legs, the support of the body would be taken away, and a person would die rather rapidly from asphyxiation and from shock. If the legs are not broken, the individual remains on the cross trying to pull himself up ever so slightly to improve his breathing, and also pushing himself up with his legs in order to support his blood and return the blood back to the right side of the heart so that he doesn't die in shock. Finally, it's a to and fro motion until the individual finally fatigues, simply hangs from his arms, and dies from asphyxiation and shock. We have a good example of that, an eyewitness example from the poor souls in Dachau in Germany during the Second World War where people witnessed people hung from their arms, and an individual who would be hung from his arms and would pull himself up and down in order to support life, and finally the individual would fatigue and tire and he would die in a profuse sweat, and that it was also noted that he would die with his chest expanded out and his muscles very taut in the sense of very well rounded and formed, as if some of you are weightlifters and so forth, you know, if an individual lifts weights over and over again, when he's through, his muscles are firm and well toned, and that's what the body would be left at, with the muscles firm and well toned. After the individual would die on a cross, the individual would be taken down, there were three options. The individual would be left up there to be eaten by animals or birds of prey, or he would be taken down and thrown into a pit of lye, or he would get permission, the family would get permission to take his body down and give it a proper burial. Now, to begin to study the shroud itself, we have here an artist's depiction of the shroud, whereby they show that Christ is taken down and placed on a cloth, a long cloth, 14 feet, 3 inches long, 3 feet 7 inches wide, with the half of the body on the body placed on half of the cloth and the other half of the cloth turned over on, like in this fashion, so that when you open the cloth, you see the back of a man's body and the front of a man's body. Now, this is the actual shroud as you see it. We are not interested in these marks here. These are the burn marks that took place in the fire of 1532. And I'll demonstrate how these burn marks occurred in the next slide. But what we're interested in here is really the faint image of the front of a man's body and the back of a man's body. Now, in Chambéry, when the fire took place, the cloth was placed in a silver box, and it was folded in this fashion. And when the fire took place, the heat of the box heated to the point where the silver melted and burned through the cloth. And once the cloth was opened up, you have these burn marks. Later on, these were patched by nuns after the fire. Now here, what we have is just a black and white image of the face of the man in the shroud. This is from the point of view, historical point of view, from the point in 1357 when the shroud came into, you might say, modern history, or came into existence. We had to this point in time, or at least till 1898, this is the only picture that was viewed. That is until the first photograph of the shroud was taken. Now, the first photograph of the shroud was taken by an Italian who was a lawyer. His name was Secondo Pia. And he didn't go there with a small camera like you and I would go and take a picture, but he had a large, big box camera. And just envision when, at that point in time, when he took this picture, after he took the picture, he brought his large negatives back to his darkroom, and when he was looking at these negatives, this is what he saw. The face was now much clearer, and he wondered why this was so clear. And he looked back at the other picture, the original, and he imagined looking at this and then looking at the negative that he had, that the actual cloth the face that he actually saw was a negative, and his negative was actually a positive. The important point that I'd like to make here is that the blood marks here are negative. The face is positive, but the blood marks are negative. And on the original, the blood marks are positive, and the face has a negative look. Because of these pictures, the scientific world became interested in the shroud. And many men, many physicians and scientists began to study the cloth and study these pictures. And that's what I would like to do with you this morning, is to now study these pictures from the medical point of view. You're all familiar with Quincy, MD, medical examiner, that fellow who on television had a program for many years. He would take a bone and he'd look at it and say, well, what happened to this fellow? How did he die? Was he murdered? And so forth. And basically what we're going to do now is look at these slides of the shroud and decide what happened to this individual. Now we'll start from this picture here, and we note there seems to be many blood flows from the top of the head. These are numerous. They seem to be compatible to puncture wounds at the top of the head, numerous puncture wounds or lacerations where blood would be flowing down the face. Now as we go further down the face, we like to, in medicine, we're interested in symmetry, asymmetry. Is it the same on both sides or is it different? And as we come down the face, we look underneath the left eye and we see that the cheekbone is rather smooth. But as we look underneath the right eye, we see here what seems to be what we call a contusion, as if somebody had a swelling under that eye, as if somebody had hit this man in the face with either a stick or a fist. Further, as we go down further, we see this is a bearded individual. Now here is the shroud as you actually see it. Again, the blood marks at the head, and the blood mark here at the side, and the blood marks along the arms. Notice how neat and distinct they are. These blood marks are very distinct. They're and very clear. Next slide. Now this is basically a negative of the same image. And here I would like to point out that the large pectoral muscles of the chest and the chest itself seems to be expanded, as if this man died with his chest expanded out. And also the muscles are well rounded and firm. Next slide. And here is a blow-up of the wound on the side. And as you see, there seems to be an elliptical wound here with a blood flow coming down, interrupted at this point, which seems to go around some type of object. And it's very interesting to note if the muscles of the chest are taught that there are protuberances of muscles that are anatomically correct that would cause such an interruption in the blood flow. Next slide. Here is just a schematic diagram showing a possible entrance of a wound between the 5th and 6th ribs to the right side of the lung and to the right side of the heart. Now, here's a blow-up of the hands, and this is a lot of the work that fascinated me that Barbet did. And if you note here, the wound is in the wrist, and the blood flows go in this direction. The blood flows here are compatible, as they are in other areas on the figure, with a man dying in the vertical position of crucifixion. This blood flow being 60 degrees from the vertical, blood flowing down in this direction, down toward gravity. So these blood flows are very compatible with a man dying in a position of crucifixion. Next, the fact that this wound is in the wrist and not in the palm of the hand is very significant, because as Barbet demonstrated that if you he had an opportunity at that point in time to use cadavers and placed a nail through the palm of the hand of a cadaver, and the weight of the body simply pulled through, and the weight of the body the nail could not, the nail placed in this area could not hold up the body, and the nail, it would simply pull through the hand. Now placing the nail through the wrist, there are many bones and ligaments in the wrist. He then put the weight of the body on the wrist again, and he found that this was compatible with reality, that if a nail is placed in this position, that the body would be held up very nicely, and that as opposed to a nail being placed in the palm of the hand. The next interesting thing that he did is that he had the opportunity to place a nail through a very recently dissected or removed arm for trauma or tumor, and he placed the nail through the wrist. And as he did that, he noticed that the thumb went inside the palm of the hand. The cause of that, I'm not exactly sure of whether it hit a tendon or the nerve that caused that, but what it comes down to is that if a person dies in this position, that with the thumb inside the hand, he would undergo rigor mortis and remain in that position, and he would end up with the thumb inside the hand showing 4 fingers and no thumb. It is very interesting to note here that on the shroud image we see 1, 2, 3, 4 fingers and no thumb, and here again we see 1, 2, 3, 4 fingers and no thumb. And here's just a schematic diagram of a nail going through the bones of the wrist. And here is the lower portion of the shroud as you actually see it, the patchwork. And as you see, you lose the feet as if the cloth is lying, as you picture yourself lying in bed, the loss of the lower extremities. You pick up the feet here, but the sheet doesn't seem to be picking up the lower feet. Next slide. This is better demonstrated here, where we lose the lower extremities until we reach the feet. It seems to be what looks like a excoriation about the knee, is demonstrated by the marks on the cloth here. Next slide. Now we'd like to look at the back of the image on the shroud. Again, this is actually how you see it, with the blood marks again at the numerous blood marks on the head, scourge marks on the back, a large blood flow in the back. Next slide. This would be the negative, and again we see the blood flows, numerous blood flows, as if there were numerous puncture wounds or lacerations at the top of the head. And here we see numerous what look like scourge marks on the back. And it is very interesting to note that these scourge marks are oblique. They actually come in pairs. They're dumbbell in shape, and they run obliquely and horizontally across the body, as if a man was standing on one side of this individual. If this picture were brought down and this man were being whipped with the oblique position, in the oblique position, and if we were standing on the other side, as we see these marks whipping in the oblique position, and if the person were right in this position, would be the marks are horizontal. So we have oblique marks, horizontal marks, and again oblique marks, consistent with somebody standing on one side or either side of this individual and thrashing him. The other piece of information here is this very large blood flow on the back. That blood flow is very interesting when we think in terms of how that might have gotten there. When we were looking at the front of the image, we saw that there was a large wound in the chest, and that wound, that chest area is capable of holding blood or fluid from, let's say, congestive heart failure, which a person dying in shock can very easily go into prior to death. So if the person is in the vertical position, that acts as a bowl and would hold in the fluid. But if you then would take that individual down and place him in a horizontal position, a very good chance that that fluid could pour out of the side, pour around the body, and pool along the back, as we see here. The other interesting features of this slide are the fact that these muscles of the buttocks and the hamstrings and the gastrocs are very firm and rounded, as one would expect from the description I gave you of a man dying from crucifixion, that the muscles, or from hanging, that the muscles are round and firm. Next slide. Here we have a high-powered view of the scourge marks. They are dumbbell in shape, thin in the center. They are round in the ends and thin in the center. And they come in pairs. And here we have a first-century flagrum with, these are made of either bone or lead, and they're round on the ends and thin in the middle. Next century. Now finally we have the lower portion of the shroud showing the feet as if this was an imprint of a bloody imprint of an entire foot with another foot crossed on top of it. Next slide. This is a negative of that, where the leg comes down, the left foot being over on top of the right foot here, and that would be compatible to a situation whereby a man would die in this position with the left foot placed over the right, and when his body is taken down, that it remains in this position because of undergoing a form of rigor mortis, where the body is rather stiff, and this is compatible with an individual undergoing some of the changes of rigor mortis. Next slide. Again, it looks like possibly here there would be a nail in the foot itself at this point here. Next slide. This is a schematic diagram showing where the nail would be actually placed in the foot. Well, basically, in summary, what I presented to you is a lot of information that Dr. Barbet himself had come up with and what I originally read in his book. The blood flows at the top of the head, the bruised or contusion under the eye, the fact that the chest muscles are very well formed. The chest is expanded, as well as we see the wound in the wrist and the explanation given for that, as well as the scourge marks in the back and the what appears to be rigor mortis, with the left leg being placed over in front of the right leg. It has been interesting to note that if we've discussed this, that the fact that there's blood on this body. Now, for the past 80 years, most of the books on the shroud discuss in great detail the fact that there's blood in the body, and there's a problem with this, in that we know that those of you that are familiar with Jewish customs or laws, that it was a ritual for the Jew to actually wash the body prior to burial. The proponents of the shroud stated that, well, there wasn't really enough time to wash the body. The Sabbath was imminent, and they didn't have the warm water there to do the job, and therefore they buried him almost according to the Jewish custom, but not quite according to the custom because they just didn't have the time. The people that state that the shroud is a forgery and so forth state that this could not be the body of Christ because the body has not been washed. And John states in his gospel that Christ was buried according to the Jewish custom. Therefore, the body should be washed, and this body is not washed. Well, as we began studying with our interest on the blood on the shroud, we began studying this subject, and we wanted to know how aloes and myrrh were mixed during the early Jewish times, during the time of Christ. And by accident, we came across an article in Lamb's work on Jewish death and mourning. And the article basically stated that if a man dies, a Jew dies a violent death, there is an exception to the washing of the body. The body is not washed, and the blood is to remain on the body. Well, that was very interesting, and we spent it, but it was a modern book, and we wanted to establish whether or not that this was really this same theory. Actually, there were the same rule applied to the Jewish burial customs at the time of Christ. So my wife and I spent the next year and a half pursuing this subject, and after discussing this with many rabbis and so forth, and after looking up the literature and studying the Jewish laws and studying the Mishnah and the Code of Jewish Laws, we actually came to find that indeed this was a custom during the time of Christ, that if a man dies a violent death, the blood is not washed off the body. So what we see here is consistent with a Jewish burial. And I would like to quote here from the Code of Jewish Law the following. One who fell and died instantly, if his body was bruised and blood flowed from the wound, and there is apprehension that the blood of the soul was absorbed in his clothes, he should not be cleansed, but they should inter him in his garments and boots. But above his garments they should wrap a sheet, which is called a sobeb. It is customary to dig the earth at the spot where he fell, if the blood be there or nearby, and all that earth upon which there is blood should be buried with him. So you see, the Jew, if you would read the Mishnah, you'd understand the obsession there was about blood, especially about life's blood, blood that flowed at the time of death. In fact, the Jews were so concerned about it, they qualitated it, stating that it should flow at the time of death, and also they quantitated it. They said it had to be a quarter of a log of blood. Now, what's a quarter log of blood? A log of blood is approximately the contents of 6 eggs. So a quarter of a log of blood is about the contents of an egg and a half. In other words, a small cup of wine. And they also talk about mingled blood, blood that comes onto the body during life and at the time of death and after death. And this blood also is considered life's blood in that it's mingled. The fact that the blood at the time of death is mingled with the blood that occurred during life makes it very important, and they don't want to wash it off the body. They're very careful to leave it on the body. Now this is just a picture of the herringbone cloth. My wife and I were interested to see if cloth actually could last 2,000 years, and while we were in Turin, we were fortunate enough to have some time to spend in the Egyptian Museum, and we found some other cloths there. This cloth is not 2,000 years old, but it's 3,500 years old. Next slide. This cloth is not 2,000 years old, but 2,800 years old. So cloth can certainly last for 2,000 years if it's well kept. Now, earlier on, Eric Jumper mentioned the image area. And I like to make the distinction between, again, the image area and the blood area. Now, this is a high-powered view of the fibers over the nose. And as you see, there's no encrusted material in here at all. Next slide. This is taken over the wound on the side. And here you see some encrusted material as if there were possibly blood on this cloth. Next slide. Now what I would like to do is show you basically an experiment that we did. Again, I'd like to have you note that the images that you see, the blood images on the cloth, are very neat and distinct. Barbet suggested that these were actually transfers of blood clot, actual blood clot to cloth. In other words, from clots would be on a body, a cloth would be placed on those, the cloth would be placed over the body, and the moisture of these clots enabled the transfer of the blood to the cloth. This is because of the light here, we can't see I can't see very well this clot. First of all, I'd like to give you just a few definitions. A clot would be basically, the formation of a clot. We take liquid blood that comes out of a body. It's in liquid form, and within a 5 or 10 minute period, biological mechanism takes place and makes that liquid blood into a semi-solid, jelly-like state. And within a period of 20 to 40 minutes, a clot retraction would take place. In other words, the clot would get smaller, and it would exude a serum. And around here, it's not very well seen, but you see a very fine yellow line of serum, which is over the entire clot as well as being around the clot. Now, what we did, we lined up about 8 of these clots, and at half-hour periods, we would place a cloth over each one of these clots. In other words, we take blood and we put it in 8 different positions. And every half hour we'd take cloth 1, place it over, an hour later another cloth, an hour and a half later another cloth, and so forth, until we did this for a period of 4 hours. And after about 24 hours, we actually scraped off the excess clot, and this is what we saw. We saw these transfers that were not neat at all, but rather very messy, as opposed to a nice, neat transfer or clot, supposed clot, that we would find that we find down the shroud. And looking at this study, we would have to determine that the transfer of blood to cloth in a fashion that we would expect is not compatible with what we see on the shroud. We would have to determine from this experiment here that the blood that we see on the shroud and the transfers not being compatible, that the shroud really is rather, these blood clots are really not real, if you understand what I mean. They're not, it doesn't compare with what we see here, and what we see here are not the same. And this, but I guess it was probably 2 o'clock in the morning when I was doing this, and all of a sudden I realized that this man that I was studying, or the figure I was studying, did not die in the horizontal position as if he were shot or stabbed and found on the ground, but rather that this man died in a vertical position, that he died in a position of crucifixion. And so then taking these, doing this again, next slide, placing again clots, and these were what the clots actually look like, because the clots have not been removed. What we did is we took the clot, we put the blood on saran wrap, And again, but at this time we actually raised the clots up into the vertical position. After about 10 or 15 minutes after the blood had actually clotted, we raised it up into the vertical position, and to my surprise, I watched the serum that was within the clots actually drip away from the clot. And after we did this, we placed the cloth again at every half-hour intervals on these clots, and 24 hours later we scraped off the excess clot, and this is what we saw. Next slide. We saw very nice, neat clots, as we see also on the shroud. And it was also interesting to note that after a period of an hour and a half, at 2 hours, you would not get the transfer. And the reason for that would be it's a physical phenomena. We call it clot drying. That the clot actually, the reason why we can make the transfer is that the clot is actually moist. It contains some moisture from the serum itself. And the serum is not just around the edges, but is also on the top of the clot. And at room temperature, the clot will dry within an hour and a half. We have no idea of the circumstances of what happened with what we see on the shroud, or what happened during the events of what the moisture of the air, the temperature was at the time the clots seemed to transfer of clots took place on the victim in the shroud. But here we know that at room temperature, if you don't put the cloth on the clot within an hour and a half, you won't get a transfer. Next slide. And here is the actual cloths. As you see again, they're very neat, as you find the same kind of neat transfers that you see on the shroud. Finally, just to simulate other circumstances, we put normal saline, that would be like sweat and whatever, on 3 drops on each one of these clots, and we prolong the transfer time to approximately 2 hours. After 2 hours, you started to lose the mirror image of the clot. Here we did this, and instead of using saran wrap, we did this on skin of a normal individual. And here we see a transfer taking place in a half an hour, another one in an hour. In about an hour and a half, we start again to lose the transfer. The thing to be learned from these experiments and these pictures are basically 2 phenomena. The fact that in order to make a transfer, a neat transfer, the person should be in the vertical position, and secondly, in order to make a transfer of the mirror image, the cloth should be placed on the body within an hour and a half after death. Here is a just black and white picture of the image again. I would like you to note this image, this blood image here. As you note, it comes right from it goes right down the arm and goes right off of the image. It's not interrupted, and it goes right off to the image and ends in a pool. And for 3 years I was really fascinated by that, because it's one of the few. There's another place on the foot which has an off-image blood mark, but this one fascinated me, and I conjured up all kinds of theories of how that got off the image. I looked also in the literature and about comments on how this would have occurred. Some people said, well, the cloth got folded over somehow back onto the body and whatever, and gave me all kinds of reasons. But one day I was fortunate enough to have the entire, a full length copy of the shroud with me at home, and I got the idea that I would actually just take this cloth and put it over myself. So I, shrouded myself, you might say. And as I did that, something struck, and I feel that, and I'd like to share with you our feelings of how this actually got there. First of all, if a man dies in the position of crucifixion, hanging, body would fall over to one side. We see the blood marks here going straight down so that the blood would flow down the back of the arm, around the arm, and then actually down around to the underside of the arm, or the side of the arm, and pool, and then drip off. Now, you've all probably experienced that, maybe washing the dishes or brushing your teeth or whatever, that as you take your hands away with water on them, that the water drips down, and it just doesn't sort of drip off the side of the arm, but actually drips around to the back of the arm, pools, and drips to the floor. And that's the phenomena that we see, I think, that we have here, and I would like to show you the next slides to demonstrate that more clearly. Here is the actual a picture of the, again, of this shroud, full-size shroud image with the blood marks going down along the arm and right off of the image. You hear from this point to this point there is no image. Here there is image, and there's also blood, but here there's a blood mark that goes right off, and it's not broken at all. Now what we did is we did a tracing of this. Excellent. And then we placed this over an individual about the same size as the figure of the man in the shroud. And in looking at this from above, you can see that you don't see the image of the blood mark on the side. You see the blood going right down the side, and you lose it here. And if you look at this from the side, you see that this comes down around the back of the arm where you would expect a blood clot to have flowed down to this point and dripped off the arm. So, next slide. Taking this again, wrapping this around the arm, you see that person being in a crucified basically position with the arm up, the blood flowing down the arm, around the back underneath the elbow to the back of the arm, and you see that this fits. So what you see is what you got. It's not nothing fancy about it. It's very real, and it's there. Now, what does this demonstrate? Basically, it demonstrates three things. First of all, it confirms with Barbet's work that what we see on the body are mirror images of blood clots, and that these blood clots are consistent with a man dying in the position of crucifixion. Secondly, it shows that the image that the cloth gives a graphic study of that the cloth actually covered a three-dimensional figure, as if a man were, in other words, what we see in the shroud is usually the two-dimensional, the height and width. But here we get depth. In other words, the cloth went around and draped over a body. And finally, very interestingly, it shows that we know that the blood contacted, the cloth contacted blood on the front of the arm and also on the side of the arm. The cloth contacted blood on the front of the arm and also on the side of the arm. And that this cloth was close enough to the front of the arm to pick up the clots, and as well, it was also close enough to the side of the arm to pick up the clots. It's very interesting to note that we see an image on the front of the arm, yet there is no image on the side of the arm. Yet we know that the cloth, because the clot is there, touched the side of the arm. Therefore, it would have also touched the sweat and whatever that was on the arm. Therefore, we would have to conclude that the image formation that we see was not a contact process, in that we know that this was in contact with the side of the arm, and yet it did not show, no image is visible. So in summation, from our work, we have basically 6 points to make. One of them is that the clots, I'm sorry, there's one other point. These clots are also, in order to be transferred, must be transferred from moist blood. And if the blood is moist clots, and if those clots are moist, they are also very friable. They can be disturbed very easily. And if that's the case, in order to make these transfers possible, one would have to be very careful in taking a body down from a crucified position and placing it on a cloth and not to disturb any of these clots. There was an article in the BAR, Biblical Archaeology Review, stating that by a Jesuit, Wild, who stated that that he was convinced that the cloth was, that the shroud was a forgery, in that it would be impossible for somebody to take somebody down from the crucified position and place him on the cloth without disturbing these clots. And Wild is absolutely correct. Under any normal circumstances, that would be the case. But as I pointed out to you, the concern is very interesting to note that historically, the Jewish custom was to be very concerned about blood that flowed at the time of death, life's blood. And the fact that these clots are not disturbed is basically quite consistent with a Jewish burial, in that they would take great care not to wipe or disturb these clots. So basically, in summary then, the shroud, the information that I would like to impart to you is, I'd like to impart the last 6 points. First of all, that the fact that these clots, these transfers are mirror images and they're very distinct. That is consistent with a man dying in the vertical position. We also would like, and secondly, we'd like to note that in order to have nice distinct clots, that the cloth would have to be placed on the body of an individual who died a violent death within an hour and a half after death. Third, the fact that the blood off the left elbow, that we see the blood off the left, the blood off the left elbow that I was just pointing out is you have to pardon me because I had a long night too. We had trouble getting here. We were stuck in a snowstorm. That the blood off the left elbow points out first the image is consistent with a man who dies in the position of crucifixion. That the cloth actually draped over a human body, and that the fact that there is no image where the clot is seen off the left elbow rules against any type of contact process forming this image. And finally, the fact that these clots are are intact is consistent with a Jewish burial. Thank you very much.
The Mystery of the Shroud of Turin, with Gilbert R. Lavoie, M.D., is number 2 in the series of 7 presentations videotaped at Elizabethtown College, Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania, where a panel of 8 scholars and researchers were brought together to present their views on the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin. The symposium was jointly sponsored by the Cultural Events Committee of Elizabethtown College and the Marguerite Eyre Wilbur Foundation of Santa Barbara, California. It was organized by Dr. W. Wesley McDonald, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Elizabethtown College. Information on the additional videotapes in the Mystery of the Shroud of Turin series may be obtained by writing to Action Video Productions, 1828 State Street, East Petersburg, Pennsylvania, 17520, or phone area code 717-560-0605. The Mystery of the Shroud of Turin programs were produced by Action Video Productions, East Petersburg, Pennsylvania.